you mind if I just say something quickly? Yeah, I think this is an interesting conversation because I find what's often confused is the difference between translation and transmission. Because people often say, well, how can you trust your Bible? It's been translated so many times. And in one sense, that's true. When I pick up my critical edition of the Greek New Testament, every time I'm reading it, I'm translating it over and over and over. So in that sense, yes, my personal Greek New Testament has been translated many times. But what people often think when they say that is that the originals were written in Greek, and then after a certain amount of time, they were translated into Latin, and they got rid of all those Greek manuscripts, and the Latin was the Bible. And then, after a certain amount of time, German became the language, and so they took all those Latin manuscripts, they translated them in German, and got rid of all the Greek manuscripts. Well, that's an error of transmission. We have all of those manuscripts, like we talked about. I mean, going right back to the early 2nd century. And what's interesting, if you look at, you mentioned the King James Bible, it's fascinating to look at the manuscripts that we've discovered, even in the last 150 years, because the King James Bible was translated in 1611. And the King James Bible was actually, it was based on not manuscripts, but printed editions of the Greek New Testament. Specifically 7 editions of the complete Greek New Testament, and then the 1525 Hebrew Blomberg text. But at that time, the translators of the King James Bible were using the 3rd edition of a particular New Testament compiled by a man named Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus, when he compiled that, he had half a dozen manuscripts, 7 manuscripts, the oldest of which went back to the 10th century, and he didn't trust it. So 1611, we have text based on 7 manuscripts. Well, flash forward to 2017, we now have 24,000 manuscripts, the oldest of which go back to the beginning of the 2nd century. So as time goes on, we're not actually getting farther away from the text. We're discovering and we're becoming privy to more of what the actual original text look like. So just the caveat, the difference between translation and transmission is huge, and I find in the discussion is often confused.
And just to clarify, so as we get more and more evidence, does that change what we had when we had less evidence?
Yeah, great question. So, in fact, our oldest manuscripts, and Logan touched upon this in the talk, the oldest manuscripts we have are papyrus. It's a plant, it's a reed that's been smashed flat and then woven together. All of the papyrus manuscripts that we have, because later they started to use animal skin that was thinly sliced, and vellum, and different variations of paper. All of those ancient manuscripts in the papyrus have been found within the last 150 years, all of them. And what we found is that despite the fact that for a long time we were using later manuscripts, we've actually never found a new reading from the ones that we have. Because you see, we have all of these manuscripts, and you may have heard, you know, there's all these manuscripts, but there are all error written. If you ever heard of Bart Ehrman, he capitalizes on this fact. There's approximately 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament, and then there are 400,000 textual variants in the manuscript tradition. Well, that's an average of 1.5 variants per word. But if you actually look at the variants that are actually, as was just touched upon, are actually meaningful to the impact of the text, it accounts for less than 1%, approximately 1/2 of 1%. Which means that, sure, we have all of these variants, but the fact that the manuscript tradition is so widely attested means that it's very easy to trace the text back. And yes, those variants, those scribal additions, made their way into the manuscript tradition, but what that meant was that the original text was still preserved in there, because they were so intent on preserving the text that they even preserved the mistakes, which means that the original text is in there, and because we have such a wide swath of manuscripts, it's very easy. In fact, I think it was Andy Bannister yesterday in his talk, he talked about the allusion that's often used with the New Testament to the telephone game. I whisper something in your ear, you whisper something in your ear, and you whisper something in your ear. And at the end, we have this muddled up message that represents nothing of the original. That's often used with the New Testament. Now, besides the fact that that's a single line of transmission, and we have a ridiculous amount of multiple lines of transmission with the New Testament, a far more accurate illustration is actually a puzzle. With the New Testament, what we have is a puzzle, a 100,000 piece puzzle, well, would you rather have a puzzle with 100,100 pieces or a puzzle with 95,000 pieces? Well, obviously, with more pieces, because as you put the puzzle together, it's very easy to see the ones that don't fit, the ones that someone tried to cram in, the ones that don't finish the actual picture. And that's what we have with the New Testament.
Thank you so much. Can we give our panelists a hand? They were wonderful.